Hello class, this is lecture 4F and we're going to discuss composting today. So we are going to compare and contrast some different types of composting, and we'll identify conditions and types of worms that are ideal for vermicomposting. We'll describe stages of thermophilic composting, compare and contrast backyard and large scale thermophilic composting operations, and we'll identify why compost is a carbon neutral media for potting mixes. So some of the types of composting, one is vermicomposting, which uses litter-dwelling worms and occurs at ambient temperatures, and it works well for paper and fine food waste like coffee grounds. The next type is thermophilic composting, which uses microbes, and the microbe metabolisms cumulatively heat up the pile, and so we get a lot of heat inside of a compost pile. And then there are some variations on thermophilic composting. So those include static pile composting, where instead of being turned, like we'll talk about in a second, the piles are actually aerated using bulking agents. So it could be wood chips or shredded paper or things like that. Or in some cases, people actually install pipes to allow oxygen to flow into the pile. There's also in-vessel composting, which is where composting is done more or less in a barrel that's turned, or in some cases it's larger containers as well. There's also on-site composting, which is used by homeowners or for apartment dwellers, and or it could be used by a restaurant. But it's where composting is just done with a small amount of waste that's produced by one housing unit or one business. All right, so composting. We're going to talk about thermophilic composting here first. So composting is really just decomposition under ideal environmental conditions. So having the right amount of water, right temperatures, and so on. So the general idea is that composting takes materials with a wide C/N ratio, and it narrows that C/N ratio. So it's taking a lot of mass, and the microbes are consuming that mass, breathing out CO2, and in the process end up creating a very nutrient-rich product. So nitrogen is retained, carbon dioxide is released, and the end result is a narrower C/N ratio of substrate. And it also makes it so once we have mature compost, that compost as a soil amendment will not trigger nitrogen immobilization if it's applied to a field. So all the decomposition has taken place already, and so when you apply it to a field, you're basically applying a nice nitrogen or phosphorus source. And most composting operations do kill pathogens. It kind of depends on what's being composted and the specific method that's used. But thermophilic composting, if it's done properly, will kill most of the pathogens, as well as some of the weed seed as well. All right, so composting, it's basically turning waste products into humus or soil organic matter. And when we compost, we could take green waste with a narrow or low C/N ratio, brown waste with a wide or high C/N ratio, mix those two together, and that's going to fuel the decomposition of these microbes. But they do need proper water content, air content, and we need microbes that are present and active. And just for example here, these are the compost bins that I keep in my backyard. And so I compost a lot of our food scraps, compost leaves. These are actually all intact leaves. Most of my leaves now I shred before I put into the composter. But it's just one example of how we can compost in an on-site operation here. So the types of microbes that occur in compost, it's at least for thermophilic composting, it's mostly bacteria, as well as actinomycetes, which is a type of bacteria, and also some heat-tolerant fungi. We have kind of two categories of microbes that are categorized based on their temperature tolerance. So there are thermophiles, which can tolerate high amounts of heat or high temperatures. So this is 40 degrees or more. or 110 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is a little bit uncomfortable for you and I as far as temperature goes, but the microbes are more than happy at that temperature. Then there are mesophiles, which tolerate temperatures that are more comfortable for us. So 10 degrees to 40 degrees Celsius, or 50 to 110 degrees Celsius. So the meso means medium, so medium temperature. So those are the microbes that help out with the decomposition process at the beginning and end of the thermophilic composting process. So this figure is from a publication from Cornell, Cornell has produced a lot of, or the scientists at Cornell have produced a lot of different composting publications out there. But in this one, they have a really good example of temperature and how that plays into the different phases within thermophilic composting. So at the beginning, we have this mesophilic phase where the microbes are just starting to get going. They're building up their populations, and the temperature is starting to rise. So we have a brand new pile that was just formed. Those microbes are starting to build up in population. And eventually, once there is so much activity from the microbes and so much microbial biomass, all of their body heat will cumulatively raise the temperature of the pile. And so at the center of a windrow of compost, if you measure the temperature of the pile at the center, it will be well over 40 degrees Celsius. So usually in an industrial scale, a compost windrow, we're hoping to get temperatures of around 140 degrees Celsius, or excuse me, 140 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you have ever smoked meat, that's also about the temperature that we try to smoke meat. So we're looking for a temperature where for a long period of time, the temperature is hot enough where it's going to kill a lot of the pathogens, just like we do with when we smoke meat. It's might not be as hot as we would have on a grill, but it's going to be warm enough where over a long period of time, it's going to kill all the bad stuff. So, so during this time, it's mostly bacteria and actinomycetes. There might be some heat tolerant fungi that are active during that period, and then eventually all the good food has been used up, and the microbes will slowly start to kind of decrease in their activity, and the temperature starts to drop. And so so after this, all that's really left is some of the slowly decomposed materials that are high in lignin or high in polyphenol and so on. And the microbes shift a little bit. So we get actinomycetes, bacteria, fungi, and some other invertebrates that are starting to colonize the pile. Now, in thermophilic composting, we oftentimes will wait until we get into this mesophilic stage, and then we'll use a turner to invert the pile so that all the stuff that was on the outside of the pile is now turned to the inside. And then the whole process starts to go again. And so the temperatures will rise back up to 140 degrees Fahrenheit. And at that point, it gets hot enough where it's going to kill those pathogens again. So we try to go through a couple cycles like that, and that speeds up the whole process for composting. Oops. Now we have a video that gives you a virtual tour of the Agronomy composting facility. So I encourage you to watch this video if you haven't already, and it will walk you through how an industrial scale composting facility operates and some of the science behind composting in this sort of setup. And as K-State students, if you've ever eaten in the dining center, a lot of the food waste that's related to those dining centers actually ends up at the compost facility. We also compost things like greenhouse waste. If you've ever worked in the greenhouses at K-State, or if you've done any research with the agronomy farm, there's a lot of waste products that are from research experiments that are also composted here. So there's a lot of material that's composted each year at the K-State composting facility. The next type of compost method is vermicomposting. So vermicomposting uses what we call red worms, or sometimes called red wigglers. And so there's just a couple different species that that tolerate this sort of setup. So we need worms that have a very specific temperature tolerance, because usually these are done at ambient conditions indoors. And so we're looking for worms that prefer room temperature type temps. And your normal earthworm that you would see outdoors, those do not work well. So we can't use just any old earthworm to do vermicomposting. We need these red wigglers, which are litter dwelling worms. And in a natural environment would live in forests in the litter layer and would just consume leaves all day. But in this case, we feed them leaves and newspaper and other things, but we can also feed them food scraps, and they will happily decompose all that. So usually this is done indoors, and it can be done both in a residential scale, so just a regular worm bin that can be as simple as just some 5-gallon buckets with some holes cut in the bottom to allow worms to go up and down between buckets. Or it can be done at an industrial scale, so like you see in the picture on the top right. So in both cases, we're just using red worms to decompose food scraps and other raw materials and produce some highly valued vermicompost worm castings. And so the food that we give to these worms include food scraps. So most of the food scraps that you generate could be parts of a lettuce plant that you didn't want to eat, or some potato skins, or apple cores. So all the things that might be parts of fruits or vegetables that you're not going to eat, you can feed that to your worms. And usually we also mix in some kind of bedding material. So shredded paper is usually what works pretty well. And for the worms that I take care of, I usually just take shredded paper from old credit card statements or whatever. I shred those up in my office paper shredder, and then feed that to the worms along with some food scraps. And then worms also have sort of a gizzard like birds do. So they actually need some grit to help them break up some of the food that they're eating. And so things that work well for grit include eggshells and coffee grinds. So you're more than welcome to add those to worm bins. Things to avoid is really anything that would go rancid. So meat, oils, dairy products. If it doesn't break down, or the worms will eat it fast enough, you don't want it to go rancid and really start to smell up the composting bin, because usually these are indoors, and so it's going to make your house smell. Worms also don't like things that are very acidic, like citrus, and they also don't like things that have really strong flavors, like garlic, onions, peppers, and so on. Also, worms do eat paper, but we want to avoid glossy paper like magazines. So glossy paper and ink, try to avoid those if you can. Regular office paper or newspaper is fine. And also, we want to avoid overwatering. So we can just kind of mist the top of the compost bins with a water bottle if it's looking dry. But if you add too much water, it starts to throw off the balance of all the other microbes that are and organisms that are in the worm bin, and it can get problems with mites and other things. So some general notes on composting. If you're thinking about what is possible to be composted, basically if it was recently alive, it can be composted. So any wood theoretically could be composted. Paper was part of a tree. Anything that's food scraps. And also, this does include animals, but there are certain situations where, or certain methods where you can compost animals, where you might, you just got to be careful about animals, but if they're recently living, they can be composted. There are compostable plastics, and they're usually made from corn. And if you might have seen these in a store somewhere, they're really thin, kind of green plastic trash can liners, basically. And the thing I want to know about these is that they can only be broken down at high temperatures. And we need temperatures that are hot enough at the center of these large thermophilic composting windrows that the plastic actually breaks down and melts. So those temperatures, they basically need like 110, 120 degrees or hotter. And oftentimes in just a backyard composting bin, the temperatures won't get that hot. So only use those compostable plastics if your compost is actually destined for an industrial scale compost facility. And also, we can't feed those compostable plastics to worms, so they don't like that type of material. And we also want to avoid things that are plastic or metals or things like that. So those weren't recently living, and so we can't compost it. Now, some kind of common applications of composting. The biggest advantage of composting is that it diverts waste from our waste stream. So if you think about all the garbage that's produced by just one person, it adds up, and a lot of it is actually food waste. And not only that, food waste is actually high in water content generally, and so it's adds up to be a lot of mass. And if we can take that food waste and divert it from the waste stream and compost it, then we actually create a value-added product. Whereas that food waste, if it were to go into a dump somewhere, then it gets sealed up, and that food waste and all the microbes that are in it starts to break down in an anaerobic environment in the middle of a landfill. Then it actually starts to produce methane, and that methane has to be burned off because it can't be released to the atmosphere because it's a greenhouse gas. So it creates a lot of problems once that food waste gets into the waste stream and eventually to a landfill. So if we can divert that, we avoid one environmental problem while also creating a value-added product that we can use for a soil amendment in our garden or in our fields and so on. Now, if you are interested in landscaping and horticulture, one big advantage of compost is that it is a carbon neutral potting media. And what I mean by that is a lot of the potting medias out there are oftentimes peat that was harvested from a wetland somewhere. And so someone drained a wetland, dug up all the peat, ground it up, and then put it or bagged it up, and they sell it in your all of your gardening supply places. And so that carbon that was in that peat would not normally have been released to the atmosphere. But once it's harvested and put into potting media, then as it sits in a pot, the microbes are slowly decomposing it, because now instead of being in an anaerobic environment in the wetland, it's now in an aerobic environment in a pot. And the microbes are going to decompose it, they're going to turn it into CO2, and the CO2 gets released to the atmosphere. So it actually causes CO2 to be released. But if we have compost is recently living material. So within the last few years, most likely that carbon was in the atmosphere, it was sequestered by plants, and those plants eventually got turned into some product that eventually became compost. And so if we use that compost as the base for potting media, when that carbon gets released to the atmosphere, it doesn't actually lead to a net increase in carbon. So we can consider compost to be a carbon neutral potting media, and it's much preferred from an environmental standpoint over peat or sphagnum moss and things. Now, from an animal production standpoint, composting has some advantages too. So oftentimes in animal operations there are deaths, and so we have some cattle or hogs or whatever that pass away, and their bodies have to be processed in some way or have to be removed to prevent disease. And so if those animals, oftentimes those animals are rendered, where a rendering truck goes and picks up the animal and then turns it into other value-added products like leather or blood meal or bone meal or all these other different types of products. So that's ideal. but it does cost a lot. And in Kansas in particular, there's some areas where there's just aren't people to render animals anymore. And if they are, then they might cost a lot because they have to drive a long ways to actually get to somewhere where they can pick up an animal that needs to be rendered. And so many animal producers are starting to compost the animals that pass away from their operations. And so those animals are usually composted in place. So they basically put down a layer of bedding and manure, kind of a mix of that, put down, say, a dead cow, covered up with that same type of material, and then just let it sit. And after about 6 months to a year, all the acids that are in the animal and all the microbes that are going to decompose it, they will break it down, and all that will be left after about a year is just a few of the large bones, so femurs and pelvises and skulls, and a lot of times those are just thrown back in the pile for the next animal. So it really breaks it down into nothing, and so it does make for oftentimes a cheaper alternative to rendering, but also something that can be easily done on farm and be done quickly. So these are some examples of composting applications. There's a lot of different types of value-added products that can be made from different types of compost. So I have a quick question here for checking for understanding. So microbes that work well at temperatures over 40 degrees Celsius or 110 degrees Fahrenheit are called what? Cryophiles, mesophiles, or thermophiles? So pause here if you want to think about it. All right, the correct answer is thermophiles. So thermo, think warm, like a thermos. So thermophiles prefer warm conditions, or they tolerate warm conditions, and they work well at temperatures over 40 degrees Celsius. And that will conclude our lecture on composting.